The wind off the fjord carried salt and silence. Behind her, the longhouse stood empty, its men gone to sea for weeks, maybe months. She stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the low sun, and from her belt hung the keys. Not a delicate trinket, but heavy forged iron, catching the last light. Listen to them clink. That sound was authority. It meant she commanded the stores, the locks, the very rhythm of the farm. Now, look at those keys and ask yourself, what power did they truly unlock? This wasn't some modern dream of equality. It was something far more grounded and, in its own way, far more formidable. We're going to explore the legal and domestic power of Viking women without turning history into politics. We'll see precisely where their authority in Norse law was real, solid as the doorframe she stood in, and where it was limited. Because in a world built on survival, the power of the household keys, the authority revealed in the sagas, was never a small thing. This is the story of practical power. Before we ever step foot on a Viking farm, we have to pull back the lens and look at what most of Europe actually looked like for women during this age. If you were a woman born somewhere in Christian medieval Europe, say England, France, or the Holy Roman Empire, your legal identity was, in simple terms, not fully your own. There was a legal doctrine called coverture. Now, I won't drown you in wordy definitions, but here's what it meant day to day. Upon marriage, your legal rights were essentially folded into your husband's. You couldn't independently own land. You couldn't enter contracts under your own name. If you brought a dowry into the marriage, he controlled it. You worked. You managed households, yes. But in the eyes of the law, you were largely invisible, permanently under the guardianship of a father, then a husband, then perhaps a son. And leaving a marriage? In most places, that simply wasn't an option. The church heavily restricted divorce. An unhappy wife was in many practical ways trapped, legally bound until death. For the vast majority of women, formal public roles in courts, assemblies, or political life simply didn't exist. They were spoken for, not speaking themselves. This was the hard, unvarnished reality. The woman's world was one of private influence, not public authority. Now contrast that rigid reality with what popular culture has fed us about the North. You know the image. The fiery Shieldmaiden, sword in hand, standing shield to shield with the men on the battlefield, equal in every way. The television version of history. It's a thrilling image, and I'll admit, it sells a lot of stories. But it distorts history almost beyond recognition. It sets up an expectation we need to dismantle right now, because it clouds the real, far more interesting truth. Viking women were not equal to men. I repeat that because it's essential. Their world was deeply hierarchical. It was often brutal, always violent, and any space that involved formal warfare, public politics, or the Thing assembly was overwhelmingly dominated by men. So no, they did not have equal rights. But, and this is the crux of everything we're going to explore, a rigid zero-sum comparison to the Shieldmaiden myth completely misses the point. Because while they lacked the fantasy sword, they held types of legal and household authority that a gentle-born lady in France or a peasant woman in Germany could scarcely dream of. The power to own ancestral land outright, the astonishingly modern ability to initiate a divorce and reclaim their dowry, the solemn, unchallenged command of the farm in their husband's absence. These weren't small loopholes. They were defined, hard-won legal rights coded into Norse law and recorded in the sagas of old Scandinavian history. So the assumption we usually carry into tales of pre-modern medieval women is that they had no power anywhere. That the story is a flat, unchanging line of pure repression. What you're going to see in the Norse family structure is something different entirely. It was a kind of authority shaped by icy winds and sheer survival, a practical power that existed in the gaps where men's lives were lost to the sea and the raid. To understand why it took this shape, we start where their authority was most visible, at home. And so, we return to that image, the keys. In our modern eyes, it's easy to see a heavy iron key hanging from a brooch and think of it as a pretty piece of jewelry, a symbolic trinket of domesticity. But if you could hold the real thing in your hand, you'd feel the lie in that immediately. These weren't delicate, and they certainly weren't decorative. This weight you feel in your palm, the cold iron chilling your skin, that's the weight of absolute control. A bunch of keys was a job description, carved in metal. It was the office of the husfreyja, the mistress of the house, and it signified command over the entire internal engine of the farmstead. Think about what was actually locked behind the doors these keys protected. This wasn't just a closet under the stairs. We're talking about the stores that made the difference between life and death during a long, dark Nordic winter. Keys for the chest that held the grain, the lifeblood for daily bread and ale. Keys for the pantry where stacks of dried fish, pungent and protein-rich, kept starvation at bay. Keys for the cold store, packed with precious butter and hard cheese. There were keys for the textile room, guarding wool before it was spun, linen before it was woven, and the finished bolts of cloth itself, which, as we'll see, was basically a currency. Then you had the locked boxes tucked into the private bed closet, the household silver, the scales for weighing hack silver in trade, the iron cooking pots worth a fortune, even the chest of medicinal herbs, the knowledge of which could save a warrior from a festering wound, was under her lock and key. If it had value, if it could be eaten, traded, or used to keep the farm alive, it sat behind a door she alone could open. Now let's stretch that image a little further, because what happened when the men weren't even there? A Viking farm could be a lonely place for a man, because he was expected to be gone, maybe for months on end. Raiding season, trading expeditions to distant markets, or simply fishing far off the coast where the cod ran thick. The men were ghosts, and in their absence, the household keys transformed from a symbol of domestic management into a symbol of operational command. The woman with the keys didn't just hand out wool to the servants. She ran the entire economic unit. She became the de facto head of the farm. She directed the labor of slaves and hired hands, deciding who mended the stone walls and who cleared the far pasture. She had her eye on the sky, deciding when to bring in the hay and when to move the sheep to lower ground. Her decisions weren't about making a home feel cozy. They were about resource allocation, security, and keeping every single person and animal on that property alive and productive. Looking for an equivalent in the medieval world, you'll be searching for a long time. Of course, the sagas give us a glimpse of this lived reality, if you know how to read them. The tales aren't dry legal documents, they're stories, literature meant to entertain, but they reflect a cultural ideal so vividly that you know a seed of hard truth sits inside the drama. You have figures like Ord the Deep-Minded, a woman of staggering authority who settled land, ordered marriages for her crew, and commanded a loyalty that most chieftains would envy. Or look at the countless fiery housewives peppering the Icelandic family sagas, women who slam food on the table and use shame like a weapon to push their reluctant husbands toward vengeance. They weren't meek. The fact that they feature so prominently and so forcefully as household authority figures tells us that the role was not just respected, it was feared enough to inspire poetry and prose for centuries. The archetype existed because the power existed. And what gave that power its sharpest edge wasn't food, but fabric. In a climate where a man could freeze to death on a hillside without the right kind of coat, the person who made the clothing held fundamental leverage over survival. Textile production was not a casual pastime. It was a massive, labor-intensive industry. Shearing the sheep, beating the flax, spinning endless miles of thread, weaving heavy woolen sailcloth that a ship depended on to catch the wind. All of it fell under her domain. The woman who could equip a crew with sea-ready woolens wasn't a passive figure. She was a manufacturing boss. The keys were not a trinket. They were a job. A big job. But for all this immense practical authority within the four walls of the farm, even this wasn't the limit of her influence. Because while she ruled the keys indoors, the law itself, the hard, unforgiving code of the North, was quietly building a framework of power around her that was unlike anything her European contemporaries could dream of. It is precisely this fertile intellectual crossroads that allowed the Mausian to transcend mere collection, transforming into an engine of unprecedented knowledge synthesis. The Ptolemies, shrewd in their cultural diplomacy, funded not just scrolls but the minds capable of deciphering them. They imported intellectual capital with the same aggressive strategy applied to physical goods, housing and feeding scholars in a collegiate structure that predated modern universities by 2 millennia. This state-sponsored brain trust, liberated from the mundane burdens of survival, could dissect the works of Homer, map the circumference of the Earth, or argue the heliocentric model in an atmosphere of relentless, often cutthroat, academic rigor. Consider the concrete mechanics of their textual obsession. Any ship docking at Alexandria's bustling harbour was subject to a search, not for contraband, but for books. Royal agents confiscated every scroll found, which was swiftly copied by an army of scribes housed within the palace complex. The ingeniously duplicitous policy often saw the pristine copy returned to its unsuspecting owner, while the original was deposited into the library's vaults with the chillingly precise label, "From the ships." This was not mere thievery. It was a desperate, systematic attempt to accumulate an authoritative master copy of human knowledge before the vicissitudes of time and transcription errors could corrupt it further. The library wasn't just a passive archive. It was a filtration plant for truth itself, striving to purify corrupted textual traditions and establish definitive editions, most famously of the Homeric epics under the editorial genius of Xenodotus of Ephesus. This concentration of source material triggered an intellectual cascade. Having a flawed copy of the Iliad alongside an older version allowed the application of rudimentary textual criticism. Geographic knowledge exploded when Eratosthenes, with access to travelogues and survey data from Carthage to the Indus, measured the Earth's circumference using nothing but a gnomon, a well, and an elegant geometric proof of parallel angles. His calculation, accurate to within a few percent, was a direct product of archival collision, a library-driven big data problem solved via pure reason. The medical texts of Hippocrates were compared and annotated, while the anatomical research of Herophilus and Erasistratus flourished through the unprecedented and ethically harrowing practice of human vivisection on condemned prisoners, a dark lantern of discovery fueled by the same Ptolemaic absolutism that funded the scroll hunts. The library's existence normalized a dangerous bargain, total patronage in exchange for total dedication, with the boundaries of moral inquiry drawn only at the edge of the pharaoh's whim. Yet the most profound metamorphosis was linguistic. The Septuagint, the legendary translation of the Hebrew Torah into Koine Greek by 72 scholars, was a civilizational crucible. Beyond the apocryphal legend of their miraculous agreement after isolation, the project actualized the library's ultimate ambition, to render the world's wisdom digestible to the Hellenic mind. It syncretized the legalistic, monolithic God of the Hebrews with the philosophical framework of Greek metaphysics, creating the conceptual vocabulary that would later incubate early Christian theology. Without this single massive translation act, a bridge between Jerusalem and Athens built on papyrus shores, the intellectual architecture of the Western world would be unrecognizable. The library didn't just shelve gods side by side, it forcibly hybridized their linguistic genomes, proving that to translate is to fundamentally transform a deity. This centrifuging of culture inevitably generated friction. The scholarly haven was also a snake pit of rival schools, bitter factions, and the high-stakes anxiety of the court-dependent intellectual. The satirical poets lampooned the cloistered bookworms, fattening on endless beans and droning over verbal quibbles in the muse's birdcage. Yet it was this pressurized, dense intellectual ecosystem that produced the systematic study of grammar, prosody, and literary canonization. Callimachus's Pinakes, far more than a catalogue, was a bibliographic seismograph spanning 120 scrolls, categorizing authors by discipline and enacting a judgment of what mattered. It was the first self-conscious map of literature itself, a metatext that asked whether any single scroll, no matter how ancient or sacred, could represent a final word. The very act of classifying all knowledge implicitly raised the terrifying specter of its limits, a ghost that haunts the digital libraries of our own age, still wrestling with the Alexandrian dream of a universal and frictionless archive that forever recedes like a burning horizon. And perhaps the place where that legal power became most tangible wasn't in a courtroom but in the cold, damp soil of the family farm and the heavy iron keys hanging from a woman's belt. When we talk about property and inheritance in the Norse world, we have to scrub our minds clean of the modern idea of a simple will. For Viking women, economic leverage was a tangled web of custom, necessity, and a concept of family bigger than any individual. Inheritance rules were not a straight line to a daughter. They were a priority system where the axe and the plough usually passed to the son. A daughter could inherit, often did receive a share, particularly in the absence of male siblings, but a brother's claim typically took precedence. The land wasn't just property, it was the physical manifestation of the family's soul, so keeping it within the male line was the default. Yet the law made a profound exception for widows, one that radically reset a woman's standing overnight. If the husband died, the wife didn't become a dependent guest in her own home. She could inherit and manage the entire farm until her sons came of age, and in many regions, she ran the show for life if she chose not to remarry. This turned her into the powerhouse of the Norse family. This legal standing wasn't just about owning things, it was about personhood in the blood-soaked arena of kin-based justice. You see this starkly in the concept of the ringvinner. She was a woman designated to receive a wergild, the blood price compensation for a slain kinsman. Think about what that means. In a society where avenging a murder was a sacred family duty, having a specific legal term for a woman who could formally receive that payment indicates a recognized legal standing alien to many other medieval cultures. She wasn't just a grieving bystander. She was a financial and legal actor in the settlement of a feud, a knot tying the frayed ends of a bloodline back together. Now let's walk across a Viking farm on a biting spring morning, just after the loss of its owner. The widow doesn't retreat into shadows. Evidence from Runestones gives us the raw truth, hewn into granite. Stones scattered across Scandinavia were raised by women to commemorate their husbands, but if you read the language closely, they are also aggressively asserting their own status. A woman commissioning a monument wasn't buying a cheap headstone. This was a massive public display of wealth and control. The inscriptions often show a woman claiming ownership, declaring she built this bridge or raised this stone, powerful acts that told the community the farm was still a going concern under her command. We know from these silent stones that a widow could take over a vast trading business or manage a sprawling estate, her authority symbolized by the household keys at her waist, which marked her as the ruler of the domestic economy. But we have to be careful not to paint a picture of a proto-feminist utopia. A woman's ability to own or inherit land was almost always tied to her role as a custodian of family property, not as a fully independent right-bearer. Her power was relational, flowing from her position as the link between a dead husband and a living son. Still, put this in context. Compare it to the crushing legal concept of coverture in English common law, where a wife's legal existence was swallowed up by her husband's the moment she said "I do," leaving her unable to own property, sign contracts, or keep her own wages. Against that bleak landscape, a Norse widow wielding the keys, managing the harvest and settling blood feuds looks monumentally powerful. But here is the truth. Class was everything. This world of power belonged to the freeholder's wife and landowning families. A thrall woman, a slave, had none of these rights, because in the eyes of the law, she wasn't a legal person with a family. She was property herself. The Sagas sphere was ruthlessly exclusive. If you find this perspective on the past refreshing, make sure you subscribe to Just Vikings and turn notifications on. We tell history straight, without gloss, yet even acknowledging the raw economic muscle a free woman could flex. We must admit that having rights on paper and living a gentle life were two radically different things. This was still a society that sharpened its axes with a song on its lips, and violence was the default solution to most problems. And that axe edge didn't spare women. While a free woman could own land and divorce a wastrel husband, she was still locked out of the formal arena where those laws were shaped. In most regions, the thing, that open-air assembly of free men, barred her voice. She could not stand as a chieftain. She could not recite the law from the law rock, and despite what modern fantasy might suggest, she was not a systematic warrior. Yes, the sagas whisper of the occasional Shieldmaiden, and grave goods sometimes confuse us by placing weapons beside female skeletons. But those cases are the exceptions that prove the rule, fiercely contested by scholars and often misinterpreted through a romantic lens. The backbone of the raiding army was male, and the formal structures of communal decision-making belonged to them alone. That reality of violence wasn't just theoretical. Feuds spiraled fast, and a woman's legal personhood often dissolved when honor was at stake. She could be handed over in a marriage to seal a fragile peace between warring clans, her body serving as a treaty, her consent a whispered afterthought. In the brutal calculus of a blood feud, legal protections against abuse could become meaningless noise. If a husband's rage or a rival's lust shattered the household calm, justice was often slow, corrupt, or simply absent. The shame culture that bound Norse society together was a double-edged blade for a woman. Her reputation was a fortress, but if an accusation of immorality breached those walls, even a baseless rumor, it could annihilate her standing and drag her family into the mud with her. We also have to ruthlessly drill down on who we're actually talking about. Saying Viking women had power is a dangerous generalization that collapses under the weight of its own ambition. A chieftain's wife in the wide-open landscapes of Iceland, standing on her doorstep with a ring of iron keys jingling at her belt, wielded an authority that a servant girl in the cramped trading alleys of Hedeby could never even dream of. Were you born into wealth, or did you freeze in a pit house? Were you a free farmer's daughter in the Trondelag, or a thrall whose legal status was little better than an animal's? We must constantly ask, which woman, where, when, and according to whose story? So if her world was still shaped by male violence and public exclusion, why does her household authority matter so much? The answer lies in the concept of practical power. To understand that, we have to reframe the entire discussion. In a world where survival was carved from thin soil and cold seas, the household was not some private domestic bubble. It was the economic engine. A Viking farm was a complex production center that spun wool into sailcloth, turned milk into cheese that lasted through winter, and managed the food stores that meant the difference between life and starvation by spring. Control over that sphere wasn't a side role. It was the backbone of family continuity and social reputation. When a woman held the keys to the storehouse, she held the power to decide who ate, who traded, and who survived. And here's something we often overlook. Viking men were gone a lot. Raiding, trading, fishing, settling disputes at distant things. These absences weren't brief. A long-ship voyage could take months, even years. This structural reality created a functional necessity for women's executive domestic authority. It wasn't born from any ideology of equality. It was brutally practical. A farm with 50 sheep, a dozen cows, servants and children could not survive if the person left in charge had to ask permission for every decision. She had to command labor, negotiate with neighbors, order a slaughter, or defend the homestead from thieves. If she lacked real power, the enterprise collapsed. The men knew it. The community knew it. So the legal tools she held, like property rights and divorce, weren't just niceties on parchment. They were the shock absorbers of a survival economy. Now you might think, didn't medieval noble women run manors when their lords were away crusading? Absolutely. But the Viking world operated on a different, more decentralized, kin-based system. In feudal Europe, a lady's authority often derived strictly from her husband's delegated lordship, with a whole legal hierarchy above her. A Norse woman, especially a widow or the wife of a traveling trader, managed a farm that was itself the primary political unit of her region. The line between private household and public power was blurred in ways that would make a continental lawyer squint. Her decisions about wool stores or meadow usage rippled directly into the family's legal standing and feud capabilities. That's a different flavor of authority. This is what I call practical power. It's the ability to make decisions that directly affect life, death, and prosperity, backed by real legal tools, but always contained within a patriarchal frame. That's the fascinating paradox. She could divorce a useless husband and walk away with her dowry, but she couldn't be a chieftain. She could own land, but a male relative typically represented her at the thing. She had more than her medieval sisters in many ways, yet far less than modern equality. And that tension is precisely why her story grabs us. When we stop looking for modern equality and start looking at who controlled the bread, the wool, and the keys, the picture of power changes completely. It shifts from a simple tale of oppression to a complex dance of influence, sweat, and legal cunning. If you want more videos that dig into the real lives of Vikings beyond the myths, let me know in the comments what topic you want next. I'm Nolan, and this is Just Vikings.